the gap between knowledge and wisdom in modernity. The great figures that the Society of Jesus has known in the last century may be very different from each other, but they all felt driven by one requirement. Faced with the current of intellectualism that risk invading their houses of education, they felt moved to give back to a knowledge reconciled with spiritual life. They had entered the Society of Jesus to become instruments to bring the light of Christ to a troubled world, and they had the sense that the dry doctrine they were being taught was unable to reach the hearts of the men around them. During their long years of academic training, they had experienced how deep was the separation between science on one hand and wisdom, spirituality on the other hand. And they all had in common the wish to remedy to its harmful effects. It is commonly considered that the origin of the problem announced by the title of this lesson goes back to the emergence of what is called, in a not very precise way, modernity. In the current sense, modernity usually designates that of the 16th century and the following centuries, especially after the so-called Renaissance up to our days. It represents the attempt of liberation of man in front of the absolute power of a God who now seems to have no connection with the finite being, under the rule of pure human reason. In the footstep of modernity, Kant, in particular with the critique of practical reason, with its fine defense of Plato's Republic, assumed a relevant role. Without an ontology, what logic can the moral life make use of? This is the burning question that Immanuel Kant tries to address on the basis of his strict pietistic education. C.S. Lewis is not totally wrong when, in The Pilgrim's Regress, he imagines the philosopher of Königsberg at his pulpit and the great thinkers posed around him to ask him to explain how the right criticism would allow morality to survive without reference to ontology, somehow next to absolute being. In examining the rules of pure thought of an object in general, transcendental logic cannot appeal to empirical moral rules. The study of theoretical reason allows only to discover the logical and formal structure of reason, and to clarify how this structure penetrates a sensible datum by constituting the space-time world, the object of sensible or intuitive knowledge. It is on his own incapable of founding the metaphysical affirmation of the things in itself. Between the a priori of theoretical reason, to which the faith of practical reason gives access, and the a posteriori of experience, there finally remains an irreducible opposition. The rigid separation between reason, Vernunft, understood as transcendental openness, and the intellect, Verstand, linked to the concepts and judgments of empirical science, makes it impossible to understand the intellect as a participation of the human subject in the divine intellect and its power to pose the truth. In this way, rational thought is deprived of its character of mystery, but also, on the other hand, intuitive intellectual thought is deprived of its non-discoverability, authenticity, and logical structure, and is thus condemned to solitude and irrationality. We know that a major contribution of Karl Rahner, one of the leading figures of the Catholic Renewal, was to help overcoming the rupture of scholastic theology with modern philosophy by demonstrating that there is no opposition between the claim of human autonomy of knowledge in modernity and Christian belief in God and morality. In a book entitled The Courage to be Priest, for example, he makes this significant statement: with its conversion towards the subject with Descartes, Kant, the German idealism, and the existentialism, modernity is what it is only because there is the Christianity, surgeon of the Christianity, possibility for the Christianity itself to be revealed more reflexively with a more reflexive rigor. End of the quotation. And so I would like to face this question, the gap between knowledge and wisdom in modernity, in 3 or 4 chapters. First of all, the rediscovery of ancient and Christian philosophy, back then to the shock brought by the reception of Aristotelianism, and then at the end, the renewal of Catholic thought in the wake of Maurice Blondel. First, the spiritual renewal in France in the 20th century. Our aim is not to tackle the whole of this very complex issue, which others have dealt with competently, but to suggest how the so-called École de Fourvière attempt to confront it with a different point of view than their German confreres. In France, the very secular country, the university offered a philosophy which has become, since Descartes, more and more separated. In the lectures, one passed from the ancient philosophy to the modern philosophy without a single word being said about the Middle Ages, judged as the expression of an old, outmoded approach to life, at most a preparatory phase of the present historical moment. In the Society of Jesus, no more than Rahner, Father Henri de Lubac held a decisive role in the common effort to overcome the tragic diastasis between theoretic science and spirituality. In his discreetly biding company, we find his elder Pierre Théa de Chardin, in whose favor he led a veritable defense and illustration, as well as other Jesuits of his generation, Gaston Fessard, also an original commentator of the exercises, Yves Moncheuil, Lubac's soulmate, Pierre Gann, author of remarkable works on the Holy Spirit, and his relationship to the Christian life, and Jean Danielou, well known for his patristic works and writings of combat. Lubac and the Jesuits gathered around him did not accept such a separation between traditional Christian thought and modern secular philosophy, because it meant a rupture not only between God and the world, but also between knowledge and spirituality. While vigorously questioning such a rupture, these Jesuits did not ignore the positive contributions of the modern period, but they aimed more at discerning the way to make modern system of thought subject to the truth of Christ, 2 Corinthians 10, and at building a philosophy more directly rooted in St. Augustine and St. Thomas. Their conviction was that far from calling into question the objectivity of knowledge, religious commitment in the face of ultimate realities appeared to them as a methodological condition to reach objectivity itself. And here you understand a certain different accent with regard to the Renerian perspective, which is complementary but more in dialogue with Kant, while here the dialogue is, as we will see, more with Plato and discussion with Aristotle. To reconcile the two separate areas to unity, this was also the yearning of the other leading theologian in German-speaking area, Hans Urs von Balthasar. Like Karl's elder brother, Hugo Rahner, to whom Balthasar was bound by a solid friendship, Balthasar saw in the Fathers of the Church, as well in Saint Ignatius of Loyola, an essential source of renewal of theology. As much as, if not more than Karl Rahner, Balthasar, whose memory is linked to a programmatic article published in 1969 in the journal Gregorianum, set himself the task of reconstructing the unity of theology and holiness, basing himself on the theological study of the missions of saints or mystics. Besides de Lubac, to whom he remained his whole life mostly grateful, a Jesuit had a particular influence on Balthasar in this regard, Eric Pshivara, an author among many other works of voluminous commentary on the spiritual exercises. The communion that bounds this whole group of friends is, so to speak, the matrix of a new form of knowledge reconciled with spiritual life. The Jesuits of so-called the École de Fourvière feel united by the common want to open the way to a humanism capable of entering discussion with modern unbelief. For them, Augustine, Bonaventure, and Thomas Aquinas, in particular the Thomism revived by Pierre Rousselot, another Jesuit, constituted the basis of the expected Catholic renewal. In the House of Fourvière, as in most of the Society's educational institutions, prevailed, on the contrary, a Suarezzian apologetic mentality, preoccupied with showing the logical coherence of the truths of faith and with highlighting the supposed contradictions of the idealistic systematics based on an unlimited confidence in natural reason. I would like to now explain a bit more about Francisco Suarez, the leading figure of the School of Salamanca movement. In the ecclesiastical colleges where they studied, it was indeed to Suarez that de Lubac and his friend were exposed. in his Disputationes Metaphysicae, 1597, the Spanish Jesuit intends to repropose Aristotle's metaphysics, but presents an analysis of being permitted by a precise presupposition. In order to reach the representative content of being, one starts from the formal concept present in the mind. In this work, thought keeps itself strictly in an immediate way in the universal abstract sphere of rational concepts, of the ens ut sic, and of its adequate objects, the non-material substances whose first and excellent is God himself. Reacting against the excesses of nominalism, for which thought is an interhuman instrument of understanding, which consists merely in naming things, giving meanings to the flatus vocis. Reacting on these excesses, Suarez stresses the possibility of arriving at a conception of being as univocal by means of the intellectus dividens et componens. However, keeping strictly within the perspective of a formal logic that proceeds by categorical predication, Suarez, for whatever his intentions may be, reaches the point of reducing being to its universally known meaning, ultimately identifying it with essence. In such a perspective, analogy is obliterated by the univocality of the concept of being, which applies to God and creatures with the distinction of only of degree. According to Suarez, in fact, human reason has God himself as its adequate object. Nothing can therefore escape its domain of competence, not even supernatural realities, since there is nothing outside God. This omni and global conception of reason led to a dialectical representation of the relationship between theology and metaphysics. On the one hand, theology is essentially received from a supernatural light and from revealed principles, philosophy then serving as an instrument for the explanation and justification of its discourse. But on the other hand, precisely, theology finds its coherence and justification only in the conclusive power of human discourse. It is no longer the latter that enlightens natural thought, but the latter, on the contrary, that leads it to its fulfillment. God himself is thus circumscribed by the horizon of human thought, and the whole of reality must enter the frame of reason. Suarez considers, therefore, logically, that the actual existence as an act or actuality of an essence is not affirmed in a physical way according to the thing, but in a metaphysical way according to reason. That's a very important point, In the right line of the Scotian tradition, being has no other meaning than that of being thought. Metaphysics has no other place than that of the intelligible. It is now from physics that the reality of things comes. In this way, the principles of a preeminence of modern physics, science, of the real over metaphysics built in the unreal are established. Theological thought focuses on abstract and general concepts as well as on their adequate objects, but it lets the real escape. It develops a closed and artificial predicative logic, tending unceasingly to become more and more complex because of its reflexive effort of internal coherence. But it is not followed by the believing conscience of the church, because the prayer, the faith, and the life of the people of God develops henceforth outside its systematics. Between theology and Christian life, the divorce is pronounced. I would like to say now a short word about the shock brought by the reception of Aristotelianism in the Middle Age, because we find here the very root of the problem I have just alluded at. But in order not to be too long, I will concentrate on what Blondel says in his famous Lettres sur l'apologétique. Blondel wonders how the Middle Ages could have succumbed to the illusion of finding help in such a philosophy, so foreign to the Christian spirit. Already in Aristotle, indeed, is to be found a tendency towards the radical autonomy of reason, which will acquire its most rigorous expression in Spinonism. Philosophy becomes here a liberal discipline. Let us listen to this sentence, for example, I quote here Aristotle: "The science which knows to what end each thing must be done is the most authoritative of the sciences, and more authoritative than any ancillary science. And this end is the good in each class, and in general, the supreme goal in the whole of nature." The use of not only reasoning, but rationalistic reason modeled on an abstract logic will lead scholastic theology to become increasingly detached from revelation and a reason inspired by Christian faith and love. The doctrine of natural being, far from opening as it should the way to definitive truth, is made autonomous from religion, with the claim of providing man with a sufficient solution to his deepest question. Aristotle, of course, speaks of a life which is more than human and which we are sometimes allowed to reach becoming gods. But for him, it is the activity of rational contemplation which affects this divine life in man, an activity which has its beginning and its end in ourselves. And it is metaphysic, which is the full knowledge of being, which encloses being, which gives us being, and, if one may so put it, gives us salvation. So that instead of finding in this a point of insertion for the supernatural, we should recognize that it implies in advance the exclusion of the supernatural, and that this sublime and aspiring doctrine makes pure philosophy a candidate for the highest place of all, however high this proves to be. Such a philosophical doctrine becomes so an alternative way of salvation. Here we could add something about Thomas Aquinas, because he could avoid this danger, but after him it was not anymore so. Let's now say a word about the rediscovery of ancient and Christian philosophy. Not Aristotle, but Plato. Why? Because our Jesuits were studying the fathers of the church, and through the fathers of the church, they came to Plato. To overcome the impasses of a knowledge based on pure intellect, which is only an abstraction, and to rediscover the importance of wisdom rightly understood, it was necessary to return to the medieval authors themselves and to the fathers of the church who had inspired them. The study of the fathers of the church, notably Origen, Gregor of Nyssa, Augustine, Dionysius, Maximus the Confessor, leads these Jesuits to relook at ancient philosophy, not Aristotle, but Plato, as said, as the supreme knowledge of the ultimate reason of the world contains, this leads this Jesuit to relook at ancient philosophy as a spiritual exercise from where comes then speculation. Philosophy, which is the supreme knowledge of the ultimate reasons of the world, contains a moral moment and thus a moment of decision, because without decision, no final turning of man to the total truth, to the absolute, can be possible. The thought which had an enormous influence on the vision of the Father is obviously Platonism. For Plato, philosophy is literally the love of truth, wisdom, a confrontation with truth as the total object of his reflection, an activity that goes beyond pure theoretical thought, indeed, that engages the whole man in his concrete existence, a way of life determined by the desire for knowledge, but a knowledge that is not acquired in a manner of mere science, but of being, of a wisdom that would transform the one who possesses it, allowing man to access the greater perfection of himself. This activity requires from the philosopher a moral decision, a personal conversion in favor of truth. And this implies that he is always willing to abandon the field of knowledge conceptually formulated to transcend into a higher field. If Plato and other thinkers of pagan antiquity took on all the labor of conceptual research, it was because they felt moved by a spiritual passion, an eros for total truth, a passion that involved their whole person. They were aware that only the adventure of the spirit, the risk of unconditioned dedication, would allow them to nourish the hope of going beyond the penultimate realities. Contact with ancient philosophy confirmed these Jesuits in their conviction. The issue at stake in philosophical activities, the ultimate thing that man can achieve, and therefore the philosopher undertakes the fascinating and promising adventure of the spirit, running the risk of a total surrender. He lets the field of conceptually formulated knowledge transcend itself into a mystical, orphic, mythical, and in a certain way symbolic field, with the conviction that this transcendence, and precisely it, is the philosophical act in view of which all the antecedent conceptual work was worthwhile, so to speak, at the foundation and matter of higher knowledge. If the pagan philosopher is already animated by a spiritual experience marked by the hope of a higher knowledge, in which he sees as the reward of all the previous conceptual work, all the more so is the Christian philosopher, whose spirituality, nourished by living faith in Jesus Christ, cannot fail to involve in one way or another his intellectual effort. The Middle Ages took up the ancient term of Christian philosophy to designate the exercise of a practical discernment aimed at bringing to light the authentic value of things as it is revealed to those who renounce the world and its vanities. It is a matter of a lived wisdom, a mode of existence according to reason, which, however, conforms from its very beginning to the biblical teaching of the most authentic ecclesial tradition. It is called Philosophia Spiritualis, or divine, in the conviction that the philosopher par excellence and the compendium of philosophy is Christ. Ipsa philosophia Christus. He, in fact, explains Leclerc, is the incarnate wisdom of God, and Mary, in whom the mystery of the incarnation was fulfilled, is called Christianorum Philosophia. Christians must put themselves in her school. Philosophari in Maria. For the Christian thinker, the foundation of reason are his faith in Christ. For him, indeed, the decision in favor of ultimate realities cannot be carefully separated from that other total decision, the need for which runs through the gospel like a leitmotif, the decision for God, which concretely means the decision for Christ and his church. There is no place in the soul for true ultimate interest or donation. That love which attracts Plotinus toward the infinite beauty of the one and makes knowledge of it possible has no other name in the Christian thinker, Augustine, than love of the triune God. From the same eros, philosophy and theology are nourished in him. It is only as a believer, as the theologian, that the Christian philosopher can live. The passion for the ultimate thing that a non-Christian thinker lives by is for him nothing but his faith. The study of the history of Christianity led to the ever more convincing discovery that what was and what is alive in Christian philosophy throughout this period owes its life to faith and theology. Only to the extent that great Christian thinkers were believers, were they also sometimes great philosophers. The decision, the option, the Christian choice was found by them in that place where non-Christian thinkers decide for the absolute, for their good. For them, the fundamental passion by which they were animated was the truth revealed in the personal divine Logos. He who qualifies himself so is the infinite truth as God, in his unity with the Father in the Holy Spirit. But this infinite truth has in him appeared in the figure of a finite earthly truth. Since the sun lived on earth, truth can no longer be considered as an impenetrable transcendent reality. That's a very important point. But must take on the sense of something accessible, though eternally excessive and dominant. Where Catholic philosophy had been alive in Middle Ages, the eros of thought had pushed it beyond the penultimate sphere of philosophumena to that incarnate truth, source of a Christian wisdom, able to give the ultimate answer to pagan wisdom. And so we come now to the last chapter, the renewal of Catholic thought in the wake of Maurice Blondel. Always thinking of our Jesuits in France and also Balthasar and this kind of intellectual family. It is with Maurice Blondel that de Lubac and his friends will seek the means to remedy this situation we have described. The rupture of the modernity. From him, they have, from Blondel, they have learned that true philosophy is the holiness of reason. La véritable philosophie est la sainteté de la raison, held the French Catholic philosopher in the spirit of his master Bernard of Clairvaux. And they have learned so not only by reading his writings, but in contact with his person. To express his own impressions, Father de Lubac reports the words with which one of his friends sketched his portrait during a visit in 1935. I quote, "In his presence, I understood from the outset what it meant to consider the teaching profession as a kind of priesthood." He was a lay. In Maurice Blondel's patient voice and sustained eloquence, there were at that time inflection of goodness, charity, and urbanity in the broad sense of that word that I have rarely found in so developed and refined a degree in men of the church. In the conversation of this so-called great combatant of ideas, there was not the least trace of that bitterness that visible in Maritain, at times shown through in the Kantian ardor or Lachaise ray. I left Maurice Blondel not only enlightened, but calmed, and reading his long works, which are more spoken than written, I found once again that immense patience, at once gentle and persistence, which ended in triumphing over all. Labor improbus omnia vincit. Once again, the meek have inherited the earth. End of the quotation. Blondel's philosophy was decisive in the renewal of Catholic thought in France. It had been surreptitiously introduced into the scholasticate of Fourvière through its promoter, Father Auguste Valençay. Although philosophical in nature, it had been conceived in the penetrating clarity of faith and brought to the young Jesuits the instruments of reflection they were seeking. The philosopher of Aix clearly discerned the impasse to which the neo-scholastic Suarezien mentality was leading. I quote, "By its method, by all its aspiration, this conception tends to envelop the entire order of thought and reality, to presuppose or substitute theory for practice." End of quotation. It was necessary, on the contrary, according to him, to find a sense of concrete unity, to free itself from the closed game of the ratiocinate thought. I quote again, "One fears to confuse," he exclaimed. "One must fear not to unite enough, to make of Christianity only a surcroît postiche, an artificial overlay." End of quotation. The key to the problem for him lies in action. It is in action that the unity of knowledge and life is woven. Thus, he explains himself in a writing making memory of his first work. The action seemed to me to be this substantial link which constitutes the concrete unity of every being by assuming its communion with all. It is not, in fact, the conference in us of thought and life, of individual originality and of social and even total order, of science and faith. The action is the simple link by which the individual initiative is exerted within a multiplicity of influences. It comes from the universal, it returns to it, but by introducing the decisive. It is the geometrical place where the natural, the human, the divine meet. End of quotation. The action reconciles theoretical comprehension and practical obedience because it has never separated them. Blondel goes one step further. Ultimately, the action that constitutes the key to the metaphysical problem is the very concrete practice of the Christian and that of the saints. His diaries gives us the first testimony of this brilliant intuition. I quote, "Life is infinitely simpler and more mysterious at the same time than our ratiocinative thinking estimates. The very naive prospecting, the very concrete decision of the child, of the man, of the people, of the humble scholar, here is indeed the righteousness which goes to heaven and sums up all the living forces of the world and of God in the common work of nature, of reason, and of grace." End of quotation. In this holy action, the decisive question of life and being is played out, and the most authentic metaphysic will never be more than its discursive form. It must be inscribed in the total reality which, for the believer, is the love of God and neighbor, as it is exerted in the pure and simple soul. Blondel collects here the teaching of the gospel. For Christ, in fact, there is no authentic knowledge of God except in action in conformity with his will. It is not anyone who says to me, "Lord, Lord," who will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the person who does the will of my Father in heaven. I will then be brief in my conclusion because I could not develop everything here. Let's go to the conclusion without giving the development. We find among the Jesuits belonging to what has been called the École de Fourvière the same concern not to separate abstract knowledge from total and real knowledge. Theologically, the vision of faith. The same inscription of the concept in the reality always wider. Or finally, the same consideration of the knowledge from and in the love. They all question the Gnostic claim to possess an exact science understood as the power to dominate the world on this side and beyond death. Far from advocating the arrogance of autonomous reason, authentic philosophy in their eyes promotes the service of the whole man to the ultimate truth that transcends him. Philosophy deserves the name of wisdom to the extent that the man who practices it with the effort proper to reason, to reach the objectivity of knowledge, leave the field of science and its speculative formulas transcend into the field of analogy. Not only analogy of faith, but analogy of being. In their attempt to overcome the diastasis between true gnosis and pistis, between the serious commitment of the intellectus fidei and the existential acceptance of the truth, they aim at reconquering, because of these principles, the unity of holiness and witness in the life of the Church that was given in the first centuries of our era and already in ancient philosophy. Thank you.